Hi everyone and welcome to a new video on the CBI channel. In this tutorial series we're creating a calendar inside of our Django and React application. This is not the first video in this series, in fact we've already done 5 before, in which we've completed a basic setup, explored different full calendar views, displayed our database data on our calendar, given different events different colors, and we enabled multi-select filtering of the events on our calendar. In this video, we're going to continue and we're going to be adding some date filters to our calendar. And this is going to mean that we can filter within a date range so that only certain events are going to be displayed. And next to that, it will also show you how you can chain multiple filters in your full calendar so you can continue and explore more of it yourself. In the end, it's going to look something like this, where we can select a from date and a to date, and it only shows the dates before and after those dates. Now to realize this, we're going to be following 5 steps. We're going to start by making some installs for Material UI, specifically towards a date picker and day.js. Next, we're going to use a Material UI date picker and add that to our project, because that's what we're going to be using to filter out the dates of our events. Then we're going to parameterize this form and display it on our page and see how we can get it to work, because we need to filter our events based on the value inside of our date picker form. As a last step, we're going to be testing the results to check if everything works the way that we expect. And to make sure that we can select a date range, we're going to be making use of Material UI's date pickers. And you can find all of the date pickers that are available in the Material UI documentation under the date pickers section. Now, in this tutorial series, we'll be using a basic date picker, which allows us to click on that calendar, select a from date, and also select a to date, and everything in between should be displayed. Now, before we can use this date picker right here, we first need to make some installs. So in the Material UI documentation on the date pickers, I'm going to go to Get Started. And in here, we notice that we need to install MMUI X date pickers and also npm install day.js, which is a date library. So I'm going to copy over the npm install on the first line. And we're going to go back to our code and stop our front-end server for a minute. And in there, I'm going to do npm install @mui/x date pickers. And let's give this some time to install. The next package that we need is npm install day.js. So we're going to copy that over, go back to our code, and also install npm install day.js. And with those packages installed, we are now able to bring the date picker to our project. So in this documentation, I'm going to go to the date components and then select the date picker. And in here, we're just going to be using the basic date picker, which is going to allow us to select certain dates. Now I'm going to click on expand the code and make sure that I have JavaScript selected, and then copy over everything that is in here. And inside of our project, we're going to go to the forms folder right here, and we're going to create a new file, and I'm going to call that datepickerform.jsx. And in this file, we can just copy over everything from the documentation. The only thing that I'm going to change is the name right here, because we're going to call this date picker form. Now, similarly to the last video, we also want to add some parameters here. And the first parameter that we're going to be adding is the label, because we want to use this date picker form for both the from date and the to date, which means that we don't want to copy over this entire form with another title, but we just want to add a parameter for that title. So inside of label, I'm going to replace this with some squarely brackets and calling this label. And then inside of date picker form right here, I'm going to say that this function expects to receive a label, which means that we can use this with different labels and make sure that we have it configured for both the from date and the to date. With that done, we can now try to display it on our project. So we're going to go over to our calendar6.jsx page. And the first thing that we need to do is import our new date form into our project. So we'll do import date picker form from forms/date picker form. And inside of the second box in our return statement, so below our multi-select form, we're going to add this new form. So over here, we can say date picker form. Let's make sure that this is going to look like a actual code block. And what we just saw inside of the configuration is that we need to give this a label because it expects to receive a title for the form. So in this case, I'm going to say that this is the from date. And hopefully when we now start our server, we should see a date picker form in our project. So let's start our front end server by doing npm run dev. And let's also check if our backend server is running, which is the case. And now let's check out the result. And when we take a look at our browser, you can see that we actually encounter an error. And when we go to our console, you can see that we get an error in our box.js file. And it states that create theme underscore default is not a function. So it actually states that a component for Material UI is causing us an error. Now, to solve this issue, we need to go to a series of steps. The first thing what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove our date picker form from our calendar 6. Next, we're also going to remove the date picker form from here because we actually don't want to display it for a minute. Then we're also going to go to our files, and inside of the date picker form.jsx, I'm just going to comment out everything that is there. As a next step, we're going to uninstall the package for the date pickers. So I'm going to stop my server, and we're going to do npm uninstall, and then we paste in the m@mui x date pickers. And we're going to do the same thing for npm uninstall day.js. So now we have nothing relating to our date picker or day.js inside of our project. Then when we do npm run dev, let's see if our code is working now. And you can see that we're now seeing our calendar again, and it's all looking quite good. Now inside of our project, we need to make some changes. At every place where I'm now importing box from Material UI, we're going to change the way that this is going to look. And we want to show it like this, like import box from @mui/material/box. So I'm going to copy that one over, and I know where I'm using it inside of my project. So I'm going to replace our calendar 6.jsx, the import of box from material/box. I'm going to do the same thing inside of the calendar 5.jsx page. And we also have it inside of our navbar, but in there I already corrected it right here. So it needs to be like this. Now, as a quick check, you can also go to search and check if you have import box somewhere in your code, or even without this space like this. And you can see that there are no results found. So it seems like we've corrected everything there is. Now we can start this process all over again, and we can go to the date and time picker and install the date picker again by npm install mui date pickers. And we can also npm install day.js. And now let's see what happens if we comment out our date picker form and we save this. And then we're going to go back to our calendar 6.jsx and import the date picker. And then we're going to put the date picker back inside of this box right here, like this. And then we're going to copy over the label and say that this is going to be the from date. And hopefully when we now start our server, we should see this form in our page. And you can now see that indeed it appears inside of our application. Now, this is incredibly buggy, and I think it has something to do with Material UI. So basically, before you install anything for the date pickers, make sure that the way that you display box is correct. So now that we have fixed this annoying little bug, we can evaluate what is actually happening right here. We can see that we now have a form for the from date, and we're also going to create another one inside of this other box, but then for the to date. So we have two separate forms. Like so. Now the first thing I immediately notice is that this form right here is a little bit broader than the form we have in here. So let's see how we can change that. So back in our code, and we're going to go to our date picker form right here. And inside of the date picker thing right here, we're going to add some styling. We're going to do that by sx, then an is sign, and 2 times the squarely brackets, like so. And in there, we can state that the width of this particular component needs to be 100%. And let's now save it and go back to our browser. And now you can see that all of the forms have quite a big width, especially the from date to the to date, but now our status form is not completely there. So let's also make sure that that one is now corrected. And inside of our multi-select form, you can see that the width is set at 300, but in this case, I'm just going to set the width at 100%. So let's save it and see what we see inside of the browser. And now all of the forms inside of this calendar have the same width, showing enough room for selecting dates and also the statuses right there. And that's very nice because we can now select the from dates and the to dates, but nothing is happening yet inside of our events. So let's make sure that we can now use these values to actually filter our events. So we're going to go over to our code, and in there we first want to make a few changes to our calendar 6 file. Similarly as what we did in the previous video, we want to make sure that the value of our date picker form is stored in a constant, and we're then going to use that constant to further filter our filtered events. So let's first do that for the from date, where we can create a new constant, and that constant is going to be called from date and set from date. And that is going to be equal to use state. And inside of from date and set from date, we're going to set the default value in use state to nothing, because we don't want to have any selection being done before the user actually is on the page. Okay, so what we now need to do, we need to make sure that from date is going to be linked to the value of our forms. So when our form changes, we want to reflect the changes both in this from date right here, but also in the value of our form, because it needs to go both ways. Now, the first thing what we can then do is make sure that the value of our form is always going to be equal to from date. So inside of our date picker form for the from date, we're going to add a new parameter called value, and that value is going to be equal to from date. Now we also need to go to our date picker form and also add another parameter in here for value, and then state that the value of our form needs to be equal to the value of the parameter, like here. So this covers one way of the street, where the value of our form is always going to be equal to this variable right here. Now we need to make sure that when a user makes a change to our form right here, it is also going to be reflected in the from date so that the values are correct when we filter the events and also inside of our form. Now to do that, we need to change the onChange statement of the form, because every time a value changes, we want to use set from date to populate this value, and this value will then filter our events and also show the right input in our form. And we're going to define this onChange statement below this from date. So in there, we can say that constant from date change, and then we can do an is sign, and then in there specify new date, because that is what we're going to be creating. And then we do an arrow function like this. And now we can define what needs to happen when the value of the form changes. And what we want to do is we want to use the set from date, because we want to change the list of the date that is selected. And in there, we want to populate it with the new date. Now, of course, we also need to tell our form that we have a new onChange method inside of our calendar. So we're going to add another parameter to our form, and that is going to be called onChange. And in here, we specify that the from date change is going to be the method that takes care of the changes in our form. Now, of course, we also need to add this as a parameter to our date picker form. So on the top, we're going to say that we also expect an onChange parameter to be happening. And then also here, we need to define that the actual onChange method is going to be equal to onChange. So this is going to make sure that the logic that we have just written is going to be the way that form's changing. So let's save what we have right now. Now, before we're going to check out the end result, we need to do two more things. The first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to set the default value of our from date equal to null, because otherwise, in some cases, it is going to display undefined, which is going to cause an error inside of our console. And also, every time we set a new from date, I also want to log that in our console so we can see exactly what the value is when we change something in our date picker. So below the set from date, I'm going to do console.log. And in there, I'm going to say that the name of this log is going to be selected from date. And the value that we want to see is new date, because that is the actual value of our form. And then we're going to do dot format and put it in the format of day, month, year. So it's a little bit more readable for us. So now let's go to our browser and see if it logs the correct values when we make a change to our date picker. And we are now back inside of our browser. And then if I click inspect again and we go to the console, we should see a new date being mentioned right here if we select one from our from date. And you can indeed see that if we select the 9th of May, that we also get that in the selected from date. And the same goes if we select the 28th, it also works correctly. So this seems to be working just fine. Now, an important next step is to also make sure that our events are being filtered based on this value. And the thing that we want to achieve is that when the value of our form is still null, we don't want to filter anything at all because we just want to see all of the events. But when we select a certain date, we only want to get events where the date is after the date that we have selected. So inside of our filtered events constant, I'm going to add two ensigns, which lets it know that we have another condition coming up. Now, to do this full formula, we also need to make an import, and that import is day.js. And that is going to help us with formatting the days a little bit. So we're going to do import day.js from day.js. And now we can use this to make this logic complete. So the first thing that we want to do is we want to check if there even is a date selected. Because sometimes it happens that we have still null because the user just lands at the page. And to validate that, we can do an exclamation mark and then put in the from date. Next, we can also do an or statement like this with these two symbols. And then we state that day.js, and then we're going to refer to event.start. And that needs to be after, so is after the min date that we have selected. And then after that, we're going to do a comma and specify the word day. So what is happening here exactly? The first thing that we evaluate with the exclamation mark in the from date is if there is actually a date present. And the reason that we do that, because sometimes it can happen that there is no filter being applied at all. Next, we're going to also add an or statement because we also want to filter something if the start date from our event is after the minimum date that we have selected. So what we do right here is we use day.js to make sure that our event's start date is being compared to the date inside of our form. And we use the is after to make sure that the start date needs to be after the min date. And the reason that we mention day here is because that's a level of detail that we want to compare on. If we would not mention day, then it's going to compare it with a day, but also with a time, which means that it works a little bit differently. And in this case, we only have full days in our database. If you don't want to have a comparison on day, but on time, you can just delete this and it should work for you as well. And I actually made a small typo because in here I specify min date, but it needs to be from date. So let's save that again and check out the result. And we now see our calendar on the page with all of the dates. So let's see if I now select the 7th of May, if this event is going to disappear. So if I say that the 7th of May needs to be considered, you can see that our event now disappears. And when I change it back to the 2nd of May, it appears again because it needs to be after that particular date. Now, what we do notice right here, that if we apply a filter on the date, so let's say we want to filter on all of the events after the 2nd of May, and I now say that I don't want to see completed, it doesn't actually work because completed is now still visible inside of our calendar. And the reason for that is that we're not evaluating these two things separately. So to make sure that it works separately and it's going to evaluate both the status and also the date, I can put some round brackets around the full comparison for the date like this. And when we now get to our front end again, and I can filter based on that I want to see after the 6th, but I also don't want to see completed, so I remove that one. It now works exactly the way that we expect. So now that this works correctly, we can also do the to date. So this actually is a little bit of copy and pasting because we can actually just copy over this and say instead of the from date, we want to have the to date and set to date. And let's also use a capital. Then we can also say that we have a to date change and we want to change the value of set to date instead of the value of the set from date. And then we can also log that to make sure that we see it selected to date in here. Now, we also make sure that in our form, this is going to be applied correctly. So we're going to copy over the parameters of the value and the onChange and also add those to our toDate form. But now the value in here needs to be from the toDate and the onChange needs to be the toDate change. Now, as a last thing, we also want to add this to our filtered events. So we can add another and sign and copy over this entire statement right here. But now we are going to evaluate the to date, make sure that it is before the event.end. So we're going to change this to is before, and it needs to be before the to date. And we again want to evaluate it based on the days because we don't want to do it based on day and time. Now let's see if we get the right results. Okay, and we're now back in our browser. So let's make up a condition that I don't want to see any data where the to date is before the 28th. So if I now select the 28th of May, it should get rid of this one right here, and it does. Now let's say that we also don't want to see the open condition. So we want to have this one not being there. Then we can also use that one. So it's still working correctly like this. Now what we can also do is check if our from date and our to date work correctly in sync. So let's say that I want to have a from date from after the 7th of May, which filters out the first one. And then I want to have nothing shown with a date before the 29th. So let's say that I just take the 27th. Then you see that we don't see those in there as well. Now, the last thing what I would like to do is make sure that the date formats inside of our forms are actually in day, month, year, because that makes the most sense to most people. So let's go to our code and make that small change as well. Now we can actually achieve that by doing a small import from day.js. So we can do import and then day.js/locale and then slash the actual locale that we want to use. Now I'm based in the Netherlands, so I can do NL in this particular case, like this. And then we can change the date adapter right here, because after this localization provider, we can do adapter locale and set that to NL. And this should make sure that our forms are going to display it in the Dutch date convention. So let's see if that is actually the case. Yeah, because if I now take the dates from the 16th and do the dates like this, it actually makes sense. And also when we delete this, it still shows our events correctly. And let's also delete these values. You can see that our filters still work the way that we expect. And that is actually all for today. In this video, I showed you how you can implement date filters and filter on multiple criteria using Django FullCalendar. In the next video, we're going to continue and we're going to be adding links to the events on our page so that we can go to a details page which displays more information about our appointments. I hope you've enjoyed this video. If you did, please leave a like and subscribe, and I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.